Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Schools Forum. Just a quick reminder, if you could, those of you that are attending via Teams, if you could mute your microphones throughout the meeting until you want to speak, that would be fantastic. So this is my first time of chairing the meeting in a hybrid format, so I'm going to be heavily dependent upon my two beautiful assistants, Simon and Tim, throughout the afternoon. So if I do stumble along, please forgive me. So we're going to make a start straight away. I'm going to ask Simon with regards to apologies, please.
Thank you, Chair. So we've received apologies from Philip Siddell, from Sadie Jones, Craig Hodgson, Lindy Nyrup, Mark Davis. We've also received apologies from Kim Prince Anson and Jessica Chambers, who was Roden, who have actually both resigned. So we wish them well and thank them for their services to the forum.
Thank you, Simon. Okay. Any declarations of interest before we start on the main agenda? Steve? I think you're still muted, Steve, if you want to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
We can indeed.
Yeah. Item 6, notice of concern. I have connections with two schools that are listed on the notice of concerns.
Okay, thank you. Duly noted.
Thank you.
Any other declarations of interest? No? Okay, thank you very much. We will now move on to item 3, which is minutes of the meeting held on the 14th of November. First question is, are there any questions or queries around the accuracy of the minutes before we move on to matters arising?
Thank you, Chair. So it was just to note something that has been raised to me this afternoon with regards to the minutes. I accidentally missed off that at the last meeting, Steve Breeze didn't attend and did send his apologies, but he sent a substitute, Leslie Lloyd, as well. So I've updated that on the current minutes for you to sign.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, any other questions or queries with regards to the accuracy of the minutes? No? Okay, we'll now move on to item 4, which is matters arising. I'll update on two items that you will have seen. Firstly is in respect of the MIAS vote that we needed to defer after the last meeting. As you'll see from the minutes, the relevant members that were able to vote in that had a separate meeting afterwards and excuse me, agreed then to dedelegate the funding for the MIAS service as per the agenda last time. Similarly, there was another update with regards to the 0.5% clawback in relation to the high needs block. So at this point, I'll invite Tim just to update colleagues.
Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, just to say that as we informed everybody at the last Schools Forum meeting, following the decision not to support the 0.5% switch, we duly submitted the disapplication request, and on the letter is dated the 24th of December. So during the Christmas period, we received a letter from the Education and Skills Funding Agency informing us that our disapplication request had been approved by the Secretary of State.
Thank you, Tim. Now, I know the last time that this happened, there was a question that was raised at the relevant meeting where a question was asked as to whether or not there was any explanation with regards to why it was awarded by the Secretary of State. And I've asked him that this time round as well. And in essence, the short answer is no. So I'm going to suggest that if Forum are happy for me to do that, that I'll write in my role as chair to the Secretary of State to ask for further details around the decision that was made. If anybody has any objection to that, if you could raise your hand or If you have a further query, then raise your hand at this point. Kerry, you've got your hand up. Would you like to come in?
No, sorry, I've pressed the wrong button. I'm really sorry.
That's okay, Kerry. That's absolutely fine. Okay. Any others, please, that have pressed the button correctly? Okay, I'll undertake that and update for the next time that we meet. Item 5, decisions taken by the Chairman under delegated powers. There are none, which leads us on to item 6, notice of concern and licence deficit agreements. And I'll hand over to you, Melanie.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon. So just to point out, as normal, this report relates to Staffordshire maintained schools only. Obviously, it looks very different to our normal report, so I just wanted to give a bit of a background and context to it. So January last year, Forum approved quite a few changes to the Staffordshire scheme for financing schools. I think the first point we need to note is it was changed so it read, a notice of concern will no longer be issued to those schools who have an actual deficit or a budgetary deficit in the current year. And instead, those schools will receive a licence deficit plan. So what we've had to do, if any schools that sat on a notice of concern for those reasons, we've actually put a licence deficit plan into place. So of the first list, you'll see there are 16 schools on the list. 11 had actually previously been reported to Forum as having a notice of concern. At the time the guidance changed, the Entrust Schools finance team were also working with another 2 schools. Further down the report, there's 3 schools listed who have been issued with a licence deficit plan because of a planned budgetary deficit in 24-25, and one of them had already been reported to Forum. What I wanted this to show is that the majority of the schools in this section have been issued with a licence deficit plan, even though they had already had a notice of concern into place and had already been reported to Forum at a previous date. The second point that Forum approved last January was the first reason that a notice of concern should be issued was when years 2 and 3 of the school's published multi-year modeller indicate that a school can't operate within their in-year funding and reserves are not sustainable. So the list of schools shown in paragraph 5 are actually showing a cumulative deficit position at the end of year 2, so at the end of 25-26 at the moment. What we want to do as Entrust Schools finance team is support those schools who are looking at a deficit in year 2 and year 3, so those schools who are looking at a notice of concern, just to make sure we have got early intervention into place and we can reduce or eliminate that forecast deficit. We are working closely with the local authority, so with Tim, with Charles, just to make sure we are understanding the impact of our recommendations from an educational standards point of view and obviously from a safeguarding point of view. There has been a delay in reporting to Forum. We wanted to completely satisfy ourselves that the schools being reported to were correct. Because of the work and support we've put in place, we have been able to retract 8 notices of concerns which did initially go out, so those aren't being reported to Forum today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mel. Quick question from me. How do the numbers this year compare to previous years at the same point?
We're in a very different position because of the changes to the guidance last January. Obviously, more schools are in an actual deficit. More schools are looking at a budgetary deficit in years 2 at the moment. I couldn't give exact figures without having that information.
Okay, thank you. Steve.
Yes, thanks, Alan. Thanks, Mel. Without going into too much detail, Mel, obviously, but can you just say a little bit more about the support that schools on the list are receiving from your team, and also whether there is any direct cost to schools for that support and for additional meetings and visits that might be required?
Yeah, sorry. So obviously, we're going out, we're understanding the school environment. Obviously, if we're looking at big cost savings, we're always going to be looking at staffing. So we're doing a lot of staffing planning. We're doing a lot of integrated curriculum financial planning, which is the DFE tool. We're understanding the ratios, we're understanding what the particular school needs. We're looking at pupil numbers how we can structure the school going forwards. Obviously, we are looking at keep my mic off. We are looking at non-staffing costs as well. In terms of cost of the school, initial visits are funded by the local authority, so funded by Staffordshire County Council. Then as part of the terms of the licence deficit or notice of concern agreement, schools do have to pay for termly visits from one of our accountants.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Mel with regards to this item? No? Okay, thank you, Mel.
Thank you.
Luke, on school budgets 25-26.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. So the provisional government settlement for 25-26 was announced on the 18th of December, and the January meeting provides a good opportunity to communicate parts of the announcement that are pertinent to the schools forum. I'll start with the schools block and the funding allocation announcements. So the schools block allocation, excluding the growth funding, has increased by 1.9% from 24-25. That's including the additional grants added to the schools block in 24-25 and rolled into the schools block for 25-26. The growth funding allocation is 2.4 million, which is lower than the 2.9 million estimated in the November forum report. The falling roles allocation is £283,000, and as previously mentioned by Tim, the 0.5% funding switch from schools to the high needs block was approved by the Secretary of State. On to how we will pass the funding on. So the schools budgets will again be set using the national funding formula. The teachers pay additional grant, teachers pensions, employer contributions grant and core school budget grants have been rolled into the NFF for 25-26. Core factors within the NFF have increased by 0.5%. Free school meals funding rates have increased by 1%. And Staffordshire will set the minimum funding guarantee at the maximum permissible level of 0%. We will manage affordability through the per pupils gains cap, and it is estimated the cap will be circa 0.75%. On to the central school services block. So as anticipated, the historic commitments allocation has reduced to £924,000. Required to fund the prudential borrowing. The ongoing commitments allocation is £4.8 million, and this will fund the retained duties approved at forum in November. The underspend of approximately £0.5 million will be transferred to the DSG deficit. And finally, on to early years. So in 25-26, the government are investing an additional £2 billion funding for the early years entitlements budget to support the rollout of 30 hours of government funded early education from September 2025. Staffordshire rates received from government have been increased as follows. So the 3 and 4 year old hourly rate per child has increased by 4.4%. Or 24 pence to £5.71 in 25-26. It's worth noting this is the funding floor, and the national average hourly funding rate is £6.12. The 2-year-old hourly rate per child has increased by 3.7%, or 28 pence to £7.94 in 25-26. The national average hourly funding rate is £8.53. And the under 2-year-old hourly rate per child has increased by 3.6%, or 37 pence to £10.77 in 25-26. The national average hourly funding rate is £11.54. And the last thing I wanted to mention was the early years workshop took place last week on the 17th of January with early years providers to discuss how we pass this on. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Luke. So in terms of a there's obviously clearly a lot of figures there, Luke. With regards to a summary document, is there going to be one that will be prepped and shared for colleagues?
I can put together a summary document. Yes, I don't think we've done it in the past, but yeah, I can put one together if that's what is wanted. Yeah.
Thank you, Luke. It's just that clearly the next year or so are going to be absolutely pivotal with regards to funding in schools, and I think that having an overview document, as you've just verbally given back to us there, would be really helpful for colleagues within the forum, so I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Steve?
Yes, thanks. Luke, can you just remind us the 0.5% switch to high needs? What does that actually equate to in the 25, 26 it'll be, won't it, in terms of pounds?
So I think the 0.5% funding switch was 3.46 million. Hopefully somebody will correct me if I've got that wrong quickly.
Yeah, that's right, Luke.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Tim?
It was just to note from the PVI sector in particular, it was very welcomed again that the early years reference group workshop around funding happened, and just again to reiterate how much work had been put in by Staffordshire County Council, Luke and Anthony, who were in the meeting today, and that was really well received by different sectors of the early years workforce and providers across Staffordshire as well.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions or any other comments? Okay, thank you, Luke.
Thanks.
Okay, we will now move on to item 8, which is the falling roles funding criteria, and Andrew is presenting on this item.
Thank you, Chair. So the paper's fairly straightforward, I hope. For the first time, Staffordshire's been allocated falling roles fund by the ESFA. The ESFA use a formulaic approach to calculate the allocation to the county council or to the local authority, and then it's for the local authority through its schools forum, if it wishes, to actually agree a criteria for allocation to individual schools. So on page 2, there's a note. We note that £283,000 has been allocated based on 2 medium super output areas, which are these geographical areas used by the ONS to compare different areas of individual local authorities and across local authorities. So on paragraph 12, we've highlighted the key paragraphs that we've used to inform the proposed criteria that would be applied to Staffordshire schools for 25-26. Paragraph 13, the bullet points 1, 2 and 3 explain that all 3 criteria would need to be met in order for a school to receive an allocation from Falling Roles Fund. So they are, number 1, there's been a reduction in the number of number on roll of 10% or greater, so a large falling reduction in numbers, that there is growth across the local area in terms of pupil numbers. What that means is that we, the county council, ignore the medium super output areas, but we use what are called planning areas or cluster areas, which are typically groups of schools with some relationship, geographical, pupil numbers, etc., etc. And we look at each of these areas to see whether there's growth in at least 2 of the next 3 academic years. And then finally, we look at schools in terms of their surplus capacity. So effectively, what criterion 3 says is that if you're 90% full or over, you will not receive Falling Roles Fund. Okay. Over on page 3 is where we do identify through the proposed criteria schools that are eligible, how are they then funded? And the proposal there is that we use the reduction in pupil numbers between the last two October school census figures, and multiply that by the basic entitlement of a primary or the secondary basic entitlement. I think in old money that was the ORPU. And then finally, what I've done is on paragraph 20 is identified how many schools meet all three of those criteria. I've not named the school because we haven't agreed a formula, and it would be unfair to name the school. But if basically after applying those criteria, we're left with one school, you can see the reduction in pupils and you can see the proposed total allocation that school would receive if forum agree to the criteria as proposed. I put the chair for opening up for any particular questions, comments.
Thank you, Andrew. I can see that Steve Barr has got his hand up. Steve?
Yeah, just a simple one, Andrew. Thank you very much. You said you've identified one school. Mm-hmm. That's not going to change within the financial year in question, is it? Because if it isn't, my reading of the paper in paragraph 19, I think, is that there'll be a surplus of just over £200,000 in that fund, which will be rolled forward into DSG. Is that right, or have I misunderstood it?
No, that's the proposal. A little like exactly like the growth fund allocation, which is in the millions. We don't allocate anything like that. The balance goes back into DSG. And we're proposing exactly the same thing here. So it shouldn't change in year. We're using static data, we're using census data, we're using data that's submitted to the department in terms of these cluster areas, and we're comparing a number on roll with the school's capacity. So I would expect, unless there's something odd or unusual or exceptional happens, that we'd be coming to forum each year and explaining how the formula has been applied and which schools have or haven't received or wouldn't receive funding based on the forum's criteria. The only thing we do say, though, that we make clear in the paper, is that if the criteria allocated more funds than were in the allocation from ESFA to Staffordshire, then the allocation will be prorated, or clearly if no funds were received, we didn't receive any funding last year, for example, then nothing would be allocated to individual schools. A bit of a long-winded answer, Steve. I think I've probably gone a little bit further than you've asked.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, £200,000 is better than nothing. It's a little bit of good news. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. Are there any other questions or comments for Andrew before we move on to the vote? Doesn't seem so. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Simon to take us through the vote.
Okay, thank you, Chair. So there are a number of recommendations with this paper, and I really wish... Oh, I have brought my glasses, sorry. So I'll go through each one. Obviously, we're doing this on Teams, so I'll stop at the end of each one just to see whether anybody is voting against it. I imagine that won't be the case, but we'll take it step by step. So the first thing is just for the Schools Forum to note the latest ESFA guidance on falling roles fund. The second is that the Schools Forum agrees to the establishment of a falling roles fund for Staffordshire. So can I just check that everybody is happy with that? If there's anybody against, please raise your hands. I'm seeing nothing, so that's good. Okay, number 3, that the Schools Forum agrees the proposed school eligibility criteria and school funding calculation. I can't see any hands against, so that's fine. Number 4, that the Schools Forum agrees the proposed value of the fund for 25-26. Anybody against? No, that's fine. So if agreed, that you note the allocation to the one eligible school for 25-26. And finally, that the Schools Forum agrees to keep the fund under review, receive regular updates on the allocation of funding, and to agree the fund and criteria annually. And if there's anybody against that, I'll take it as read. No? Okay, that's carried. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. Andrew.
Yeah, just one final comment. When we report allocations of funding for growth fund, we identify which schools have been allocated funding in accordance with the formula. Given that we've agreed criteria for falling roles fund, it would be appropriate for just to advise that the school that's eligible is St John's Church of England Primary School in Keele. So if they can record that. So obviously we've agreed the criteria, applied the formula and noted the allocation to St John's.
Thank you, Andrew. Duly noted.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, item 9 is capital funding, expansion of funded childcare, early entitlements. I beg your pardon? Emily, did you want to come back in? Sorry on that.
Sorry, yeah, please. It's just a point of clarity in terms of the school that's allocated the amount. Is that, does the allocation take into consideration any conversion or academisation process?
It's blind to the governance, or it's irrelevant. It's just mainstream schools.
But mainstream schools that are remaining as mainstream schools, so it's completely superfluous. Yes. To the.
Yeah, it's not part of the calculation, not part of the criteria. It's we consider it for all state-maintained schools, academies, and local authority-maintained schools.
But if it's had an order and it is academising, that would be part of
the CTA. You know, be part of the. We'd ensure that any funds due for the schools and local authority maintained were allocated quite rightly if it became an academy. So no, you wouldn't lose out through conversion. A school wouldn't lose out through conversion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Thank you, Andrew. Okay, just double check. Are there any other further questions on that? Okay, now we'll move on to item 9, capital funding, as I said, and it's Kev that's going to lead on this item.
Yeah, hello everyone. So my name's Kev Taylor. I'm leading and supporting the early years team on the expansion of funded childcare. So in terms of the report that's been presented, basically the update on the expansion of childcare for working parents, it was announced in the government's spring budget back in 2023. And the announcement was to introduce 30 hours of funded childcare for all children over 9 months if they've got working parents. As a local authority, we have got a statutory duty to ensure there's sufficient childcare in the area, and the DfE have provided us with capital funding to support us in expanding the number of places that are available to meet that. So I suppose the summary is by September this year, all working parents with children over 9 months will be entitled to 30 hours of funded childcare. It's been introduced gradually over last year. So in April 2024, it increased for 2-year-olds with working parents to get 15 hours of funded childcare, and then recently in September that was expanded to the children over 9 months old. So from September, those 15 hours will then expand to 30 hours. So it's quite a lot of increases in childcare that's coming up. As a council, we were allocated £1.6 million to increase the number of childcare places, and it's up to us to determine the best way to prioritise that funding. That funding was also allocated to the Wraparound Childcare programme too, so that 1.6 million was for both. We've decided as a local authority to prioritise the early years funding because that's where we kind of really need the places for the expansion that we're talking about now. As we stand at the moment, there aren't any significant issues with how it's been rolled out. We've got an effective communication strategy that parents and providers are aware of what's happening. Our IT systems have been amended to cope with the additional demand and the changes that have happened. We've introduced an application process for providers and schools to apply for capital funding, and we've set up the governance arrangements in terms of establishing a group to oversee the project. So that's where we are at the moment. We've, as a summary, we've funded, at the time of this report, there's 21 providers and schools who'd received funding, and that was just over £500,000, £570,000, which has created 450 places. So that means that, simple maths, there's £1 million roughly of capital funding to be allocated in the run up to September to continue to increase the places. We've just done a provider survey. We do these twice a year, a sufficiency survey to look at where we might need these places, and we're just analysing that data at the moment. And we are seeing kind of a squeeze on places at the moment that we need to look at which areas are kind of most in need. The difficulty that we've got is that it's really difficult to predict the number of places that we may need. We know where we might need places, but it's really tricky to work out how many we need, because we don't know how many of those parents are going to. We don't know how many of those parents are already paying for places, and we don't know how many of those parents might expand and increase the amount of childcare that they might use if they're giving more funded childcare. And the other issue that we've got is in terms of there is a national recruitment and retention issues in the childcare sector. So where we've confined premises and providers who might want to expand, often a lack of staff and lack of being able to recruit staff is becoming a barrier too. So that's where we are at the moment. The next steps, as I said, we're going to analyse our sufficiency data. We're going to go down to encourage applications in the areas where we think are most in need, and we've already kind of done a bit of that. And we've got a list of more providers who've come forward to us wanting to expand, and lead up to September and the changes that are coming in, we've got a communications plan, so we should start to see more kind of our social media going out there to the providers and parents who are aware of the changes. So that's the update. There isn't a kind of an ask of this report from the schools forum. It's just to provide an update and invite any comments or questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Kevin. Vicky. Vicky, you're on mute. The classic.
Apologies, I've fallen for the staying on mute. No, just to say, Kevin, can I pick this up with you separately outside of schools forum? Just a related issue, but something slightly aside. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's fine. Do you want to send me an email?
Yeah, are you just...
Kevin.taylor@staffordshire.gov. Yeah, just send me an email, it's fine.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Someone else got the hand up, sorry, I can't see the...
Yeah, it is Tim, yeah.
Tim.
Yeah.
Hi, Tim.
Hi, Kev. Being both the PVI representatives have given their apologies, I was asked to just raise a question, if that's okay. Just to put into context the question, earlier on in the year, kind of before some of the work I think that Kev's report itemises, there was an IT issue around the portal that we have to use to submit funding claims. So therefore there was a task that was actually postponed. Knowing that work's now happened to the report, do the local authority see that there won't be any future delay, kind of that it is September 25 ready, that we're not going to see any issues around that? Just because for providers to be able to plan financially, having any delay to actual or estimate tasks, given the government are going to have 80% plus of all places.
In terms of the IT system to deliver your funding, is that what you mean, Tim? Yeah.
Yes, that's the one, yeah.
As far as I'm aware at the moment, the system isn't ready as we speak, in terms of ready for September. But obviously, there's time before that happens. I wouldn't envisage that there would be any problems. We're relying on our IT service providers to obviously capita to make the changes to their system and nationally. So, and we're not obviously not the only local authority who use that. So, I will. We have regular kind of DFE meetings where the service providers are there. So I'll raise that at the next meeting and kind of have a chat with those just to make sure that we're in line.
Fantastic, thank you. And just secondly, obviously you said how difficult it was, Kev, in terms of knowing how many places are going to be needed, and I know that those in the PVI, I'm sure, as well as maintain nursery school settings, also have the same thing. Given that schools tend to know who's going to come through their doors because of planned school places, etc., is the local authority going to ensure that there is transparency and equity in the allocation of capital funding, so that PVI settings have the same opportunities as school to expand their provision? Thinking around, you said about if you knew that there was a premises, let's say, but that you needed someone to do that, is that something that the local authority is actively seeking to do?
Yes, we're open to expansion in both PVI and schools, and I think the majority of the ones that we have funded so far have been the PVI sector at the moment. We have funded some schools, but PVI sector have been the main kind of beneficiaries of the funding so far.
Fantastic. And then just lastly, just to say, the communication in terms of this expansion has been second to none by Staffordshire County Council to all providers. Again, we couldn't have asked for more information and more updates as projects has worked through. So on behalf of PVI, that's fantastically well received. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Kevin. Any further questions on this item before I ask Kevin to talk about the wraparound childcare? No? Okay, Kevin, you're next.
Okay, yeah, it's me again. So this is the second part of the, excuse me, second part of the expansion that we're kind of leading on. So the wraparound childcare programme is around increasing places for kind of older children, so school-aged children. So it's aimed at primary school children, and the government wants wraparound childcare to be available for all children in the local area from 8 AM till 6 PM, and they want to test flexible ways of providing the childcare. We've got an allocation of capital funding and programme funding, but as I just discussed, most of the capital funding has been aimed at the early years. We decided that because we thought the majority of mainly schools that come to us have already got premises, obviously, that aren't being used in those times. So we didn't get many requests for capital funding other than pieces of equipment. So it's mainly the revenue funding that we've got. So we're allocated a 2-year allocation of £3.7 million for the wraparound revenue funding, and this was to support revenue costs such as staffing, running costs, whilst demand built, to kind of remove the risk from schools of creating something that wasn't sustainable. So we've had year 1 funding and year 2 funding. In the report it says that year 2 funding isn't confirmed. That has been confirmed now. That was confirmed just before Christmas. So we should receive the full amount of funding. On top of that, the government, you're probably aware, has announced an investment in breakfast clubs. We have received, in the report, we hadn't received the information. We have received the information now, so there will be schools piloting breakfast clubs in Staffordshire. We need to kind of work out how that sits alongside the wraparound programme when that's kind of fully introduced. So the wraparound care and the wraparound funding can be accessed by schools, PVI providers, childminders. And it supports expansion of places, it supports creating new provision, it supports increasing the hours, it supports potential offering a morning session if you only offer an afternoon session. So there's lots of ways you can access the funding, and it's generally around increasing so that we can get childcare offered 8 till 6 PM. All the childcare, wraparound care has to be sustainable by 2026, so it's not the same as the last report I've just talked about, where parents receiving funded childcare. These places need to be paid for by the parents, and eventually they need to be sustainable for the school or the provider who is providing it. So what we've done so far, we've mapped out provision across Staffordshire. We've developed the governance arrangements, as I just said in the previous report, and also for this we've developed another application process. We've submitted a delivery plan to the DFE, and we're trying to deliver that as we speak. In addition to that, we've also received, as part of that funding I've just mentioned, the 3.7 million, we've received some funding to develop an inclusive practice pathway of training, and that's around supporting wraparound providers to deliver inclusive, accessible and high quality childcare. And specifically and including those children with SEM. So the pathway is currently in development, involves different kind of training aspects, where provider staff can go down different pathways depending on their needs. And there's a number of teams across Staffordshire Council working on that at the moment. So in terms of the applications we've had, we've probably now had around 30 applications, and we've spent just over £500,000. So there is still a lot of money remaining in this for schools and providers to tap into. And we've created or expanded 550 places or more. In terms of the risks to this and the barriers that we're facing, the risk, the main barrier is the engagement of schools. As I say, we've got the number of schools we've got. We've only funded 27 schools at the moment, and that's probably higher than most local authorities because we're big. But there's a lot of money there where schools can tap into, and that might be because schools aren't interested in the funding because they don't want to expand. But there are a number of reasons why schools might not want to be involved, and we sometimes kind of struggle to engage with the schools to get them to come forward. We continue to do the communication strategy with providers and parents and schools to try and increase demand. And we've done some more this week, and we've got some schools that have come forward this week. So that is the main priority at the moment. The priority is we trying to engage schools to come forward to receive kind of the funding from us. Is there any questions on that?
There is a question from Emily. Emily?
Thank you. I was just interested in that engagement strategy, the communication piece. How has that actually been rolled out, Kevin? What's happened?
We've got our kind of early education newsletter, which goes to all funded providers, which includes schools, which the notices have gone out from. We've used the school bag probably 3 times to send information out. I've attended the school, I can't remember what it's called, the school heads, the school leaders meeting. I think we've done that twice. And we've also done press releases involving schools around that to try and get that information out there. But any other methods would be gratefully received if there's any other method that we could tap into.
I just wonder whether this is a system issue. Again, potentially, I think that because it's quite disparate and it's relatively fragmented. I think that the disjunct between the communication that comes into trust potentially and the communication that lands with the rest of the sector is possibly at odds. And I do wonder whether that is exacerbating that communication picture. But that would just be my initial concern around that some of the communications are not landing in all of the possibly but thank you for that. I think I'll go away and have a look to see what we've received in terms of academies, but it's just something I think to watch.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Tim?
I think just to pick up on a point that the chair made around how important budgets are going to be for schools moving forward, I think the government's notion around the free breakfast club model tied in at exactly the same time that the local authority is being tasked to roll out expansion for wraparound care. Having attended on behalf of an academy the expression of interest session run by the DFE around breakfast clubs, for them not to be able to say have any ballpark figure of what funding is going to be invested for that free section of wraparound care, knowing that employment is the biggest cost that you're likely to have for running a scheme like that, but also the fact that one of the caveats was you couldn't cap your numbers. So if you're a school of 180 or 500 children, you have to make it equally accessible to all, but not necessarily on a basis where you have to say children have to attend full time or for 3 days or 2 days. So staffing then becomes a real issue. And I do wonder if that possibly is butting heads with the great work that the Wraparound expansion programme that is currently going on is happening, because maybe there might be some concerns of some schools that don't realise that they are 2 separate things, or that actually that might financially impact a wraparound programme that needs to be sustainable within two academic years, when then actually all of the business is going to be funded centrally from government. But unfortunately, as we all know on this call today, funding levels are often woefully inadequate, and that could then lead to further financial pressures on schools. It was just to make that point.
Thank you, Tim. I think those are all really valid points and well made. Kevin.
Yeah, just to expand a little bit on what Tim's just said. I mean, obviously earlier on this afternoon, we saw the deficit go up quite considerably, the number of schools that are in licensed deficit positions. You add that to the falling rolls issues, you add that to the budgetary issues that we're all facing. And I think Tim actually said right at the very end of when he was talking exactly what I was thinking, which is along the lines of, it's all right having funding right now, but it's got to be sustainable in the long term. And that's not just sustainable in terms of staffing, it's also sustainable in terms of the actual building and being able to actually manage it within your establishment. So you've got capacity issues for your staff, you've got capacity of your building in terms of making sure that it continues to be okay, as well as obviously the demand. If your parents can't afford to pay, then they're not going to come. And if they're not going to come, then you're not sustainable. And all of those are very uncertain, aren't they? And in this period of uncertainty for schools where you're trying to manage a school budget, to embark on an ambitious expansion within your own building is potentially hazardous if in 12 to 18 months' time you're sitting down with your governing board and trying to explain why it's now costing you school money rather than potentially making you school money. And I do think that will inevitably have an impact on the way that head teachers and leaders are looking at it.
Thank you, Kevin. Yep, that's absolutely bang on the money. Thank you. Any further questions for Kevin before we move on to the next item? Laura?
I just wanted last point as well, really, on behalf of the special schools, due to the really increased staffing ratio that will be necessary to enable this process to take place. It's a really considered measure to offer care till 6 p.m. And so if the local authority can give any further consideration to how we can navigate that without passing 100% of the costs on to parents, which will make it inaccessible for parents, well, that would be gratefully received.
Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, at the moment, the clear guidance from the DfE is that the care should be 8 till 6, and long term it should be funded by the parents. We could have a conversation around the individual kind of special school and see and look at that. But at the moment, that is the clear guidance that we also have problems with like rural primary schools where they don't want to open until there's no demand until 6 o'clock, but we kind of butt heads with the DfE saying that there's no demand, but the DfE wants us to open it. So there's lots of little kind of caveats to the guidance that we can probably have a discussion about if needed.
Yeah, I think it's about making it an equitable offer for parents. Just because they have disabled children, that it shouldn't cost 5 times more than their children that may not be within a specialist setting.
Yeah, understood.
Thank you, Laura. Tim?
Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if this is the right place to say this, but actually not in my All Academies representation here, but in my day job, the company that I work for, we do wraparound for all in mainstream schools, so not specialist settings, completely acknowledged. But if there was any further conversation that either Kev or Laura might find useful in particular around how we look at our cohorts as a whole, so that we're making that offer equal and equitable to all. Whilst I do acknowledge that in a specialist setting, you're only going to have children who have additional needs. But if that was at all useful, then completely happy to do that outside of this meeting.
Thank you. Emily, did you want to come back in?
Just I think that compounds my earlier point, that I think, you know, that the precarious nature of what you've just described around the longevity is really dependent on the structures that are put around it and the economies of scale. And I think that's why it's so critical that the communication is targeted at the right, across the sector in the right way, because otherwise that there is a further issue with I think some settings being able to manage this as a proposition that doesn't have quite the same concern for other settings.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, any final points before we move on? No. Okay, thank you very much, Kevin.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So to continue on a consistent theme, I'm going to ask Sarah to give us the briefing update on the high needs block.
Good afternoon. This is the high needs block update for 2024-2025. As usual, this is the regular update report outlining the latest position on the high needs block, given the ongoing pressures in this area. I won't go through the paper in full, as I presume forum members have already had the opportunity to read the paper. To summarise, the paper outlines that the Q3 high needs block forecast overspend is £28 million, no change from the previous forecast. Key variances consist of an overspend of £14.6 million against the school top-up budget, which includes a rise in the number of children with EHCP AEN support in mainstream schools and academies, leading to a £5.6 million overspend. An overspend of £5.9 million in special schools and academies due to the combined impact of increasing demand and complexity. An overspend of £11.1 million in independent special schools, with numbers now in excess of 700, a 50% increase on what they were just 3 years ago. And an overspend of £2.4 million on post-16 due to rising numbers and costs. Importantly, the paper outlines the continued decline in the DSG reserve, which at the start of the year was in deficit by £30.8 million, and given the current overspend will increase to over £56 million by the end of the year. Left unaddressed, the funding gap will likely increase, and by 2029-30, Staffordshire's high needs block could be between £40 million and £80 million over budget, by which time the accumulated deficit will be somewhere between £250 million and £360 million overspent, well, in deficit. This remains a national concern, and the government has maintained the statutory override, requiring that accumulated DSG deficits should remain ring-fenced separate to the Council's other reserves through until the end of 2025-2026. This is effectively a temporary bank overdraft that will need to be repaid before it becomes so deep that it subsumes all the Council's other cash balances and effectively makes the Council bankrupt. Given the extent of the deficit, this will likely impact on the educational provision available to future children with SEND for many years to come. At its current level, the Council is already losing annual revenue returns of over £2 million per annum in lost interest, and this will increase as the deficit grows. Funding that would otherwise be available for delivering central council services. Based on our current forecasts, it's expected that by the end of 2025-2026, the deficit will be around £100 million. It still remains unknown how the government will expect authorities to deal with their accumulated shortfalls when that time comes. And there is a possibility that government will again further extend the statutory override. As such, it represents the most significant financial risk to the authority. The report goes on to provide an update on the progress of the SEND Accelerated Progress Plan and Alternative Improvement Plan. These outline how, over time, improvements in the provision for children and young people will be implemented and are essential for the delivering of the DSG Management Plan, as outlined at Schools Forum in November. Fundamental to those strategies is the Enhanced Assess Plan Do Review EAPDR pathway to ensure children can access the right support in the right place at the right time. The EAPDR pathway was launched 1 year ago, and as of this month, the weekly panel had agreed to 261 or 58% of requests. Those declines are primarily due to insufficient evidence of APDR being presented by the school as part of their graduated approach. Where a request for EAPDR is declined, individual advice and feedback is given by the panel to support the needs of the child. The decision to request an EHCNA with consensus from the team around the child was recorded for 28 children and young people, with 8 of these now having a final an EHC plan in place. This approach, focusing on developing a more inclusive system, also includes the new area of CDIS provision, which commenced in 5 of the 8 districts on the 1st of September 2024. Provision for South Staffordshire has now been commissioned and became operational in January 2025, and a further expressions of interest process is also being launched this month in the remaining 2 districts of Staffordshire Moorlands and Lichfield. Finally, the report goes on to confirm the government's funding level next year for the high needs block, which it will be around 143.6 million, 10.5 million higher than in 2024-2025, equivalent to a 7.8% increase. As has already been mentioned today, following Schools Forum rejection of the transfer, the Council subsequently made a disapplication request to the Secretary of State, which we can confirm that the government approved. And we can confirm that the government has approved our disapplication request for the 0.5% funding switch from the schools block for 2025-2026, equivalent to around 3.5 million, and to be used to fund the Council's transformation programme. This will increase the overall high needs budget next year to 147.1 million. Whilst this is better than expected, it will still not keep pace with the actual rising costs and demands we currently face, and a further large overspend is also expected next year of around 35 million, even after allowing for the additional 0.5% funding switch. In the government guidance, the government have set an MFG level for 2025-2026 of 0%, which we will be adhering to. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Sarah. Okay, I think that's Kevin.
Hi, Sarah. Just a couple of observations, really. If I might just sort of look at that EAPDR percentage that has been accepted. It's down at 58%, and the reasons given for not having accepted an EAPDR is insufficient within the evidence within the school of the normal process. If we go back to a period before EAPDR, that's what people were getting turned down for EHCNAs. So effectively, what's happening is that people are getting turned down for EAPDR for the same reason as they were getting turned down for an EHC assessment, which effectively just puts an extra jump in the process, which I suppose eases the flow through for EHCNAs because they're getting turned back at the EAPDR level before they've got to the EHC level. I know you can go straight to EHC and not go through EAPDR. However, the advice and the recommendation is to go through EAPDR because actually that's the best practice to do. So it isn't necessarily, is it just that it's smoothing out the process, or is it actually creating a logjam, but not a logjam that's assessed? Because the logjam that was the backlog that gets assessed by government and by Ofsted is correct me if I'm wrong, is when it goes through EHCNA, not when it goes through EAPDR. So is the EHCNA backlog waiting list now shorter because it's actually getting stuck at EAPDR? If it is, then that's what it is. I'm not necessarily complaining about that. It's just an observation in terms of is that what it's like? The second thing that I was going to ask was, this is a national problem, this overspend. Now, Staffordshire's put a lot of time and effort in trying to balance the books, trying to mitigate the overspend, effectively limiting how much money gets spent to try to keep the costs from spiralling out of control. Other authorities haven't done that and have gone over by huge amounts. Now, obviously, time will tell on this when the government ultimately, whichever government it's going to be, that can't kick it down the road any further, has to actually address it and decide what they're going to do about these massive overspends from lots and lots of local authorities. I do hope that when that happens, they don't just write them off. Because if they were to do that, then Staffordshire has effectively disadvantaged its own children in trying to keep a balanced book. Because lots of other authorities will be spending money on their kids and not, well, I wouldn't say not worrying about the overspend, but not getting control of an overspend or even trying to get control of an overspend. And I suppose we would all be pretty cross if actually it turned out that this money ending up getting written off, and there's no penalties for being, well, you know, it doesn't matter whether you're 5 billion overspent or 40 million overspent. Actually, it's all going to be wiped off, and I don't know what's going to happen. None of us do. It's just interesting. It's just interesting to see what's going to turn out from all of that, because we're working really hard to try to keep a lid on this. And I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do. I mean, it feels the right thing to do, but it could be frustrating if at the end of the day the government decides to do something that means that other places almost gain advantage from their inefficiencies.
Okay, Kevin, thank you. And rather than ask Sarah to respond to that, obviously the second point that you've made is not necessarily something that we're going to be able to have any clear view on at this point, but certainly to the first point and query, I'm going to ask Halit to come in, and then I'll ask Anthony to speak after Halit.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to pick out the question in the EAPDR comments, and I guess what I would say is that of the requests that have come in to the panel over the last 12 months, of which there have been 449 from schools, and these are requests that have been sanctioned by the Send and Inclusion model as it stands in the 8 districts, which is great. So these guys are sanctioning these requests coming through. These are all pre-statutory, way early in that sort of graduated approach journey. And the ones that have been agreed have demonstrated excellent assess, plan, do, review, early intervention as part of their graduated approach. So by that, I mean, and we'll all understand this, I guess, good assessment, good targeting of intervention, quality intervention, and more importantly, what we're seeing at panel is good review of the targets that were set as part of that APDR process. Now, where schools have demonstrated that they've done something that we can enhance, we've gone on and then enhanced. And what we've seen is 261 kids have gone through EAPDR, and some of those are beginning to go through into second cycle of EAPDR, which is incredible. So we're seeing that sort of iterative cycle of intervention and further improvements there, and outcomes improving for children. Some of those children have been stepped down back into the graduated response of the school. But what we are seeing, which is challenging, and then gives us a steer in terms of what our next steps are, is where we've said no to EAPDR, there have been difficulties finding something to enhance. Now, schools, in the most instances, have actually done some work with these children, but it hasn't been targeted. And more critically, when we've analysed the evidence coming in, there has been little or no review of the targets that were set. So it's almost as if the assess, plan, do, review cycle has not completed. But in the instances where we've said no to our colleagues in schools for EAPDR, the enhancement, principal officers have often popped out into the schools to have those conversations with our colleagues to help them with their graduated approach. And if we haven't been able to get out there, and bearing in mind there are only 2 principal officers for Staffordshire who are able to do this, we've given as much detailed feedback as we can. Essentially what we're dealing with here is a need to improve and support our schools with their APDR at the earliest level. In terms of the impact on EHCP requests, my sense is that it hasn't had a dramatic impact in that particular space, because we're still seeing a lot of requests for education and healthcare needs assessments. Hence some of the delays that we're seeing in terms of the processing of those assessments and finalising of those assessments. So what I would say, the direction of travel now is to enhance our support into schools at that early pre-statutory stage. And what we're currently doing is we're moving a percentage of the CDIS support that would have sat in EAPDR into that pre-EAPDR space, so that schools can access our 6 operational CDIS teams before even going anywhere near EAPDR. So that when they do make those requests, Kevin, that what we're getting is a much better quality request. So just to summarise, the early CDIS support that's going to be going in is not for the individual child, it's to improve the quality of systems level practice around SEND in schools that we feel need that level of support.
Thank you, Halit.
In terms of the financial aspects, I shall leave that to finance colleagues and Tim.
Anthony, did you want to address some of Kevin's points?
Yeah, hello. Just really on the point of Kevin's assertion that maybe other authorities have been easier going on in the award of the HCPs and the financing than we have, and that I would actually disagree. I think from what I see, every authority are trying the hardest and facing a similar challenge, and are all making very similar decisions and actions as we are regarding 0.5% funding switches, keeping MFG down to the zero, as far as they can, challenging through the Ombudsman and the likes any appeals they disagree with. They're all facing the same thing and doing the same thing and prioritising that kind of dealing with exclusion agendas in mainstream to try and address it. I think a bigger issue for those authorities that have hit that kind of cliff face earlier than us is a funding failure in the system, which is government funding, because whilst we're poorly funded, and we've demonstrated that before, there are actually some authorities even worse than us. And we showed before that those are the authorities that were the biggest deficits, the ones that even got worse funding than ourselves. And we know it's a broken system. So I'm not really going to be critical of the actions in other authorities who are ahead of us in the deficit. I think they're just on a different timeline regarding that funding disparity. I would, though, be critical of the government's response to the accumulating deficits in the delivering better value and safety valve schemes, because they prioritised those authorities and put all the resources into those few authorities at the front of the curve, ignoring all of the tsunami of deficits that are going to be impacting behind them, like Staffordshire. So I think, if anything, I'd be more critical of the government's funding model and response than any of the authority positioning on it from what I can see.
Always happy to criticise the government on funding, Anthony. Not a problem.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you. Emily, then Laura.
Thanks, Alan. I just wanted to loop back to the ADP, the APDR, and just concur with what Hallett has said. I think in terms of the pre-statutory work, I think actually it's inadvertently improved the lens that we evaluate the provision around SEND, and I think that practitioners are more cognizant now with that graduated response. I think it's actually a really strong piece of strategic work that's really robust and is improving the system considerably. Again, though, I'd come back to the communication, and I've spoken with Hallett around this. I think actually it's been really well developed and it will impact very positively. I think now we've got to ensure that practitioners in school are fully conversant and cognizant with the model and the way that it's sequentially linked, because I think it doesn't enhance that early work that we do for young people with challenge. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Emily. Laura.
Hello. Through the funded transformation of SEND, the intervention and support for birth to 5 years is essentially being removed from intervention in terms of specialist intervention from specialist settings. Early intervention, we know, is key to improve the outcomes for SEND learners and to impact the learners' outcomes. Better improvements need to be made in this area, and that, I think, will have an impact on reducing costs and improving outcomes into longer term lives for the children. Are there any plans to move into that part of the pre-statutory space and work?
Hallett?
If I've understood your question right, Laura, you're looking at how do we enhance that pre-statutory space through outreach and provision.
To 5 years, yeah.
So I guess what we're looking at there is the framework. Is the framework that we are that was launched in September and is embedding as we speak. What we want to do is make sure that we've got the best providers in that space for schools and districts to draw from. We're currently in the process of refreshing the SEND strategy. Yeah, that time has come around again. It's going to run from 2026. So what I guess I'd be wanting to do, Laura, is yourself and colleagues who are working in this space to be able to contribute to that SEND strategy, SEND and AP strategy, so that it gives us that strategic guide, because it is a partnership strategy that we need to be embedding. So really interested to see where you'd like it to go, and see whether we can develop a head of steam in that direction.
I think on behalf of the specialist academies that I'm here on behalf of now, we haven't been involved in any of that work, and so planning and provision isn't in place currently for learners in that area.
Okay, I guess what I would say is that every district has had a needs analysis conducted by SEND commissioners through the district model. That was the primary opportunity to do that work. It's ongoing, isn't it? You know, we're seeing increasing needs and increasing pressure on mainstream schools, and we know the government's direction of travel is in that particular direction. What we've got to do is make sure that the limited resource that we've got is effectively and equally or equitably deployed in that pre-statutory space. But at the same time, we need to be enhancing our special school provision as well, because we need to be working both ends of the model, don't we? So there will be further opportunities. But what I would say is that my view is that the detailed work that was done with the district teams in the district inclusion model with our SEND commissioners is going to begin to yield really good results. But the framework has significant numbers of really high quality providers on. Districts have budgets that are there that they can choose to deploy in line with their needs analysis that they've been supported to do. And I think we just need to make sure that we are embedding this new, more equitable way of spending money in the districts in that pre-statutory space.
But what I will say is there was a blocker in that because the districts were not allowed to align funding to support children preschool age. So there's a gap.
Oh, absolutely. There are many gaps, Laura. And I guess what we need to do is we need to work together to be, you know, I'm aware of many of those. We need to be working with our SEND commissioners to make sure that we're realigning those very limited and precious resources so that we're plugging those gaps.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Hal. Vicky, and then Sarah. Vicky, you're on mute again. Twice in one meeting. I think I'm going to bar you from the meeting.
Oh dear. I'll send my apologies to the next meeting. I just wanted to pick up around the communication for the direct costs to schools of the CDIS provision and the EAPDR. And just ask also around the 3.2 million that's the figure that the 0.5% switch that the Secretary of State have approved. Says in the report that would be passed on in full for the provision of SEND support. Just if there was any clarity around that, really. So probably two elements to the question.
Okay, I'll do my best. In terms of EAPDR, if a child is, or if a request is successful, education psychology provision at assess and plan and at review phases is provided by the LA. So it's not a traded activity with schools. Should there be a requirement for any do activity, so the intervention part of the EAPDR, notwithstanding the fact that the assess and plan and review are interventions, any conversation that you have is an intervention essentially if it's changing your thinking. But if there's a requirement to buy in, if you like, intervention resource, then it is a 50-50 split between the school and the local authority. Remember, this is pre-statutory activity and we're in 2025. So what we're hearing from DFE is it's an unusual position for a local authority to adopt, but a welcome position. In terms of CDIS provision, the local authority has preloaded CDIS capacity, and there will be a school's contribution to CDIS activity. So where we've been recommending CDIS support for schools that in our estimation require additional support with their APDR, we've been recommending a 4-hour block of CDIS consultation. So for example, the CDIS team in East Staffs will pop out to the school to support the senior leaders there and the SENCO. That 4-hour block will then incur, should school choose to engage with it. And again, pre-statutory, it's not the law, you don't have to engage with it, but the offer's there. You know, and if it was me, I'd want that East Staffs team in because they are exceptional, as are all of the 6 that we've appointed. But the incurred cost for that school, for that 4-hour block, is £60. And by my estimation, 4 hours of quality support for £60 is worth every penny.
The point wasn't around how much it's costing and whether we should be contributing or not and how good value that is. It was whether people are clear that that is that it is chargeable, because I wasn't until last week, and I'm on the ISPB. So
Okay.
it was picking up around communication, which has already come up a few times in today's meeting, because I don't think people are clear on that.
Right,
And I
so-
know you'll say we've told them a million times, I'm not saying you haven't, but ultimately that isn't hitting, that's not getting to
so
the
you're
people that
not
need
you're
to know
not
it.
the only one. Granted, I appreciate that. What I would say is, in November of last year, previous year, we trained 900 people in the model across Staffordshire. Every newsletter, every information burst that comes out, our local offer is absolutely crystal clear with that evidence. I guess I'd be picking this up with colleagues, chairs of the LMGs, if they need people to come and refresh colleagues' thinking. Myself, Chris Rogers, Kerry Hardy and others are more than happy to pop in and talk to either schools, groups of schools, and I've been speaking to Head Teacher Forum in a range of settings, middle schools, primary, secondary, anywhere I can get to, and reiterating a single and simple message, which is the one that I've shared today. So I would refer you in the first instance to the local offer. If not, happy to come and talk to the LMGs or the any other inclusion groups that want support.
It's not a criticism, Hallett, because I know that you will be communicating these things, but when you sat in a room of 20 heads and none of them know that if you are going down the CDIS route, it is going to cost you this amount per hour, then that is a concern, and that is going to worsen the situation, because as I mentioned in the last schools forum meeting, what sits behind the local authorities deficit of the high needs block, we've also got in our individual schools as well. So,
agreed.
you know, and then the system has changed. We're all trying to get on board with the system. We're already hemorrhaging money for children who we're paying an adult to work with when we don't get the same amount back in for that child. And you just keep cushioning that for the next child and the next child and the next child. And then when you're trying to get to lower down the system so that we're not all ending up applying for EHCs if we don't need them, the cost for your children that aren't on EHCs is also then going to impact. So then there's no more money, is there, for any of us? So I just think people need to understand that, because the system's only going to work if everybody understands the ins and outs of how, and those costs are just. I did wonder whether, because in the pack it says how many were recommended to do EAPDR, and then they didn't actually request it. Well, is that because they know that when they get onto EAPDR, they're going to have to pay half, and they haven't got the money to pay? I'm not saying it is. It just was something
So in response, there are several. We are working with the Commission CDIS teams to make sure that they're getting out there and spreading the word, and making sure that they're informing their districts about what CDIS is and what to expect. What I would say with EAPDR is schools do not automatically incur a cost, a financial cost, once they get onto EAPDR. It's only if there's any spend in the do phase.
Yeah.
So at the assess and review phases, education psychology is provided by the local authority through the funding within the model.
Mm-hmm.
So more work to be done in terms of comms, but what I would ask colleagues to do themselves, but also to encourage others to do, is to use the local offer and the EAPDR and CDIS links there within, because they are very, very clear.
Thank you, Hallett. Thank you, Vicky. Katie.
Hi everybody, can you hear me? It's just a question. Vicky's already touched on it actually. My question was about the number of schools who, having been accepted or the request accepted, schools who could have put in a request for EAPDR didn't do so within 6 weeks, and I was quite surprised by that, because you would think, because it's not always easy to get that approved. Have you done any analysis as to the reasons why? Have there been any permanent exclusions and therefore it's not been necessary, or have they gone straight to EHCNA? And I just wondered if you'd done any work on unpicking that, really.
Yeah, that was a good observation. So we're aware that 59 of the recommendations didn't make it into a request. which is a decent percentage to have a concern about. We know that one district in particular had no failures to launch, if you like, and we know that Cannock, every request that was sanctioned by the LMG in Cannock went through. There were no gaps there, so we're trying to work out what's worked there well. The initial feedback that we're getting through the send and inclusion model is it's a combination of factors. There are some children that have moved, some children that have been excluded, but the predominant factor is the availability of the SENCO to pull together the request, the evidence. And that takes more than 6 weeks. And what I would say is, in the autumn term, we had to put a time lock on the recommendation points to the request points, in order to make sure that we didn't get churned up with requests. And we said it had to be within 6 weeks. So what we have noticed is that by setting that 6-week deadline from recommendation to application, that has also driven some of the data in that space. But predominantly it's because of the capacity of SENCOs.
Could you just explain to me then, because I was going to also ask you about the actual EAPDR form, that once you get it approved that you can request EAPDR, it says on the form you've got 5 working days to get the paperwork in. So I wondered how that fit within the 6 weeks, because on the actual EAPDR request form it says, please can you submit this within 5 working days. So when you're pulling all of that information together, I wondered if that also may have contributed, because people are thinking that they've got 5 working days to get everything in and sent across, and how that fit within the 6 weeks. Because as you say, the availability of SENCOs, if they only work 1 day a week, you have a meeting on a Friday, they're perhaps not going to have met that if their working days are Friday, and whether that's a barrier at all.
If you can leave that with me, I've got the form up in front of me at the moment, but I'll interrogate that and see what's going on. I guess all I was going to say is, if you leave that with me to look at if there's a discrepancy between the 6 weeks and the 5 days, that's something that we need to iron out and make sure it's consistent. My understanding is that there needs to be a request from the school from 6 weeks that it's recommended by the district.
Okay, thank you. And any further updates? I know I asked you last time about Staffordshire Moorlands, and I know I've got Councillor Price coming to see me next week. But I just wondered if there were any updates, because in the report it says expressions of interest in January, and obviously we've only got a week of January left, so I wondered where we were at with that.
So expressions of interest open at the end of January.
Okay.
We're fairly confident that we've done a lot of groundwork in Moorlands and in Lichfield, in Tamworth, in the Moorlands, and I'm just trying to remember what the remaining district is that hasn't had the...
Moorlands and Lichfield.
It is Lichfield, it is, sorry, it's been a long day. Moorlands and Lichfield, so we've done a lot of work. Chris Rogers and I have been out to several schools to see whether we can sort of corral some interest around developing CDIS provision. What I would say is that, notwithstanding the expressions of interest process, I'm really confident that we've got good groups of schools who are going to be expressing an interest. But I guess we'll only see when they sort of submit their applications. But I'm encouraged.
Okay, thank you. Final point, Hallett, I'm sorry.
It's not so.
Final point. Do you think EAPDR has had a positive impact in reducing exclusions?
It's difficult to pinpoint whether the dependent variable has been exclusion or inclusion. What I would say is that we've got some very encouraging data coming back from schools and from parents in particular, talking about their experience of the process in terms of their voice being heard, feeling that they've been listened to, and that the interventions have been purposeful. What we do need to do going forward is try and find that capacity to crunch the data in terms of outcomes more thoroughly. But I guess as we go into 2025, that's our next development, is to begin to sort of look at some of those triangulation points of the outcomes. What we are seeing is that where kids are going to EHCP as a result of EAPDR, the process has been quicker because essentially the assessment's already been done.
Right.
But in answer to exclusion, I couldn't give you any hard and fast on that.
You know, in terms of that early intervention, trying to get funding to prevent a permanent exclusion, it's almost speaking from experience, when you permanently exclude a child, you feel like you could have, what more could we have done? It's always a really sad situation when that happens. And then funding has to be put in at the other end, whereas it would have been helpful, from a personal experience, to have had that support much earlier. And the child that did end up getting permanently excluded the EAPDR was refused. And so it's just making sure that any early intervention actually does have that impact really on children, because a permanent exclusion is never what we'd want.
Agreed.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hallett. Okay. Before we move on to the next item, are there any final questions for either Sarah or Hallett on this item? No. It looks like no. Okay, thank you both very much for your input on that item. We're now going to move on to agenda item 12, which is section 19, provision and recouping costs. So as a reminder, at the last Schools Forum meeting, this was brought up with some concerns being expressed around the quality of the communication and engagement and the rationale behind it. And so we had agreed that we would put it on this agenda as a further discussion item. I'm going to ask Carl to go through his report in a minute. I'm very grateful to Nick Mason, who sent through some points and some questions and some potential solutions from discussions with other secondary heads. So I'm going to ask Tim and Carl then at the end of this item to kind of round up and summarise one or two potential steps forward. So in the first instance, Carl, if you could update us on your report.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, I don't intend to take long there is a summary at the beginning of my report. I'm sure all the attendees have had time to read the report. I am conscious of people's concerns regarding the implementation of the recouping of a contribution towards the Section 19 funding. As is clear, this came out of guidance that was published in December 2023, and also from the growing need of the local authority to put alternative provision in place. I think within the report you can see that within the academic year 23-24, there was a total cost of 1.99 million. And that was a significant increase from some of the previous years. So it was one of those things that we felt was right to do. Since we've implemented the change, we have also noticed a slight change. We've had a drop in the number of requests coming in from schools. We have seen more schools put their own provision in place, which is excellent because they know the child much better than we'll know the child. So it has had some impact. I'm very aware of that. And obviously I'm here today along with Tim to answer people's questions.
Thank you, Carl. Nick Mason, did you want to address some of the points that you'd sent through in advance of the meeting and just give a brief summary for colleagues that haven't had sight of that document?
Yes, please. I sent through a document having collated some of the feedback that school leaders had sent to me. So if it's all right with you, Ellen, I'll just summarise the points raised and then can I go through the questions as well, please? Thank you. So schools were obviously notified by letter and the Schools Forum meeting. It was mentioned in March that in 2024 April, the ORPU would be recouped as well as PP funding for that pupil. I've had feedback that there's quite a bit of concern, and myself as well concerned, that it wasn't properly consulted on. I know that Carl's just said that the local authority are relying here on the statutory guidance, but I don't believe, or I don't feel that provides a basis for a unilateral deduction in the way that the council have done on school budgets. It's also taken effect during the school year, so it's had a significant impact on in-year budgets, particularly for those schools that run from September to August financial year. And school budgets are obviously, as all the budgets, I know we've talked a lot about budgets today, all budgets are very tight and accounted for to the penny, and with schools being hit by invoices in year for sums of money that are in the tens of thousands, it's really difficult for them to plan for effective provision for the children when this is already been spent effectively. So the ORPU money is money that schools use and rely on, as you know, for staffing, for premises, for site, and as soon as that money is taken, obviously you still have to pay those costs and it's still budgeted for. The second point was about the methodology for the invoicing or the charging for the Section 19, and it doesn't appear to be clear. Whilst it says that the methodology for a pupil who is permanently excluded is used the same for the Section 19 provision, in the case of a permanently excluded child, the child comes off roll, so there are no further checks then for the school to make. In the case of Section 19, whilst we have that funding removed, we remain responsible for safeguarding checks, for keeping in touch with pupils and their families, planning reintegrations, exam entries, potentially, if we're able to support the children through to exams. And you'd also, for those children who are likely to rely on this sort of provision, they would also need additional staffing, potentially for invigilation, for extra coursework sessions, for wider support in school, in addition to the Section 19. The local authority, rightly so, and leaders understand why the children don't come off roll, but this does mean that place there that's sitting in the school isn't funded and cannot be filled, so it doesn't enable the school to remain funded in the way that it had planned at the start of the year. The quality assurance of tutoring as well has been raised as a concern. So schools feel like they don't have the quality information about how much tutoring is taking place, the attendance to tutoring, if the tutoring is supporting the children with the right specifications, preparing them to re-enter the schools. And we feel like if providing more of our own tuition, and I know Carl's just mentioned that there's been a drop in a number of requests, and understandably schools are trying to do this themselves with again limited resources in school. It would potentially mean that more pupils, more families would ask for a home learning package, and it's a real possibility that schools could become inundated with requests for this if it's not got that rigour of the local authority agreement, because they've got particular medical evidence to support. And I also feel like this has an impact on the attendance agenda as well, so it's not supporting us really to get these children back into school. I would be really interested in the figures for attendance for children who go on to Section 19. In the local authority policy, it does say that the provision is supposed to be for a term at the most, really, and then start to reintegrate children into school. We don't have any children where that's been for a term. It's always longer for us. So it would be interesting to hear the figures if Carl or Tim has those, or if we could collate those for leaders to show how many of these children do come back from Section 19 and what we can do about bringing them back in after they've started to access it, because it feels like they get sucked into this Section 19 and then, like the learning at home, not coming into the school environment, and that perpetuates the cycle. The checks as well for coordinating through the EWO, some schools have said that that's not been consistent for them. And then I've included some specific questions with regards to Section 19 moving forwards. So if external agencies say we'd advise Section 19, or if a child is genuinely ill but we can't afford it within our school budgets, what do we do? You know, what's the next step for us, and how can we work together with the local authority to make this a provision that can be used? I wondered if Schools Forum and the local authority were aware of the email from Brown Jacobson solicitors, who state that in their view that there is no ability of the council to charge these amounts as they have sought to. So I believe that it's not in the funding agreement to schools, that whilst it's in the funding agreement that schools will have their ORPU removed should a child be permanently excluded, it's not in the funding agreement, and doesn't support the ORPU being taken without agreement by the school. And the advice from the legal advice that leaders have taken that I'm aware of has advised them not to pay these invoices. So there is some challenge to the payment of these invoices for some schools as well. With regards to the arranging the Section 19 to cease, I'd not clear on how we stop the Section 19. So if we've got children in our schools now that are on Section 19 and we can't afford to keep going with those given that the funding has changed, how do we stop that? Or how do schools say we want an end to that? And how do we broker that with parents, you know, because they've been promised a provision and then it's likely to cease because of funding issues with the school. The report for Schools Forum on page 53 states that the provision is like I say, that's where it says about the term. So stopping that provision or how many pupils have engaged for a term or less would be of really interest to us as leaders. And then potential ways forward. So they were the questions that I'd put forward, and I've sent these to Alan and to Tim via Simon. But I think that if the local authority would work with leaders to collaborate on either our own version of Section 19 so that we can support the local authority to ensure that it complies with the same policy across Staffordshire, then we can also look at how it supports attendance into schools, and we can make sure that those children can come back into schools as quickly as possible, or if they can't, how we can support that to align with our exams. And can the Staffordshire County Council provide a commission service that schools can buy into, but that has a breakdown of associated costs at the very beginning, so that we're not just signing a blank check. You know, it feels a little bit like when you order something from Amazon, you're saying, I sort of want this, but in this sort of price range, I know it's going to cost, but I'm not sure how much, and I'm not sure what I'm going to get for it, but send it to me. You know, it just feels a little bit loose in terms of what leaders are signing up to when they're signing up to Section 19. But if that was much more clear and transparent at the outset, I think we could buy into some of those services really effectively. And can we look as a group of leaders and with the local authority at other local authorities, so that we can look at how other authorities approach this and fund it. From looking at just a couple of other authorities, it's funded very differently. Some cases, the first 14 weeks, for example, are free, and then after that you pay on a weekly basis for the tuition, and you pay for what you use, so that you've still got funding to be able to do the other checks. Apologies if that's been quite a long appraisal of what's happened, but like I say, I've sent all of this information to Simon, so he'll be hopefully able to circulate it with the minutes.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, and I'm grateful to you for sending that through in advance. Like you said, there were a lot of points there, and I suspect that both Carl and Tim will do their best to address most of them in this meeting and look at a variety of different ways forward. Katie, I'm just going to hold you there for a moment, because I think that given the number of points that Nick has just covered, it's important that Carl and Tim have an opportunity to address those. And then if we have time at the end, then we'll come back to you, Katie, if that's okay. So Carl and then Tim.
Yeah, thank you, and Chair, and thank you, Nick, for sending those questions and your thoughts in advance. It was extremely helpful to have it articulated so clearly, so that we could work our way through it in preparation for today's meeting. I think the important thing, starting at the end and working my way backwards really, is that I think there are solutions here. I think there are ways that we as a local authority can work with schools to look at our joint response to children who are not able to attend school regularly due to medical conditions or other reasons, as is in the guidance. So I do think that there is a positive way forward with this, definitely. And I know Tim and I are both open to have consultations, meetings with schools and look at how we could do that. In respect to some of the things that you've raised, and obviously there was an awful lot in there, just to try and answer some, and forgive me if I've missed some bits. In respect of consultation, obviously, I don't believe that there was a formal consultation process required for the local authority to undertake. I believe that we obviously brought it to Schools Forum, we've communicated it to head teachers, we've included it on the referral form so that head teachers are aware what they're signing up to, that the training that's been delivered to schools across this the end of last year and the beginning of this academic year, we've raised this point about Section 19. So I feel like we have communicated it to schools, but obviously, as with all forms of communication, it can always be done better. So I'm quite happy to look at that and consider that as to how we could have improved it. I think the charging aspect, I think you raised some really valid points that I am prepared to go away and have a look at. So I think that's valid. I think, and I don't think this is your position, but just for clarity, for other people who may be listening, I think it's really important to understand that the ORPU that we recoup is for the period that the child's on the tuition. But as is said in the paper, the cost of that tuition is often far in excess of the ORPU that we actually recoup. So it's not that we come to schools and say, right, it's costing us X number of hundreds of pounds a week, we want all that money back. It's proportionate to the ORPU or restricted by the ORPU amount of the child. So just to make that point, we're not seeking to claim all the money back. The QA situation, this is a point that has been raised by lots of schools, and we, the local authority, have our own quality assurance department that sits within our commissioning service. So we rely on our commissioning team to first of all scrutinise any company that wants to provide a service for our children on our behalf. So they are robustly scrutinised before we allow them onto our framework. And then when they're on our framework, it's my understanding from commissioning that they then have a quality assurance process that they follow with those companies. Now, we also have, the schools yourselves, when they've raised complaints with us about companies, we've dealt with those. And when parents have raised issues directly with us, we've dealt with those as well. And vice versa, when commissioning providers have raised issues that they've had with schools, we've also intervened in those instances. So we feel we've quite a dynamic relationship with our providers. And if they're not providing the service that we want them to provide, we very quickly rectify that, either by suspending that intervention and finding something else, or by working with them to improve the quality of the service they provide. I think the link to schools is interesting because that's one of our fundamentals that we say to providers, is that they must link with the home school. It's absolutely essential for this child that they still feel part of the school and that they continue to follow they continue to follow the same syllabus as their peers, so that when they return to school, because that's everybody's ambition, they can then hopefully fit in and be up to date with everybody else. If that's not happening, then we need to know about it, because then we can talk to the providers. If EWOs are failing to act as that conduit as well between school, home and the provider, then again, any individual cases, please let us know about, and we will address, because we have our standards that we want to keep, and that would be below the standards that we want with schools. The question about children returning to their schools and the timeliness of that is challenging, and we definitely will pull some figures on that, because that's something we're very interested in. We want to get children back into school as quickly as we can, because all the research tells us that the longer they're out of school, the harder it is to get them back. And we also know that they form attachments and relationships with their providers, and then find it hard to give up those relationships sometimes to come back to school. So we try and move the situation on as quickly as we can. But as you know, and I'm not going to insult you by rehearsing it in great depth, every child is an individual, and we can only move them through the process as fast as their circumstances allow. And with some children, that is quite speedy, and we try and move it on as progressively as we can. But with other children, their difficulties in attending school are so severe that it is going to be a long commitment before we get that child back into school. So we set that one-term principle as a kind of a benchmark, so that parents don't have an expectation that it's going to be forever, because we recognise that parents were getting that misconception. So we put that one-term thing in to stop that from happening, and to hold it to check. If we feel that the child does need to come back to school and is actually fit and able to come back to school, then we hold regular reviews of how that child is doing, and the EWO should be holding regular reviews with the school, and we can cease it at any time. So if the school phoned us up tomorrow and said, we think so-and-so is fit and well to come to school now, and we could say, okay, that's fine. We take your view into account. We speak to the parent. We look at where we are, the situation. And if everything concurred with the same decision, we would stop it straight away. And if a school wanted to say, well, actually, we'll put the provision in, which some schools are doing now, then again, we can stop our provision quite quickly, depending on the contract that we have with the provider. So there isn't that isn't a huge barrier to our working relationship. I think that it is difficult, because every child is so unique, and determining the length of intervention that they need is really, really hard. And all we can do is keep going back to the school and saying, this is where we're at, what do you think? And some schools are excellent at that. They keep really robust contact with the student. They constantly looking to reintegrate them, and we're able to accelerate and move those children on. Sadly, there are some schools that need quite a lot of coaching and encouragement to do that, and those can be quite difficult and lengthy cases to move. I'll just finish with again, putting my hands up. I know that there have been some accounting mistakes made. We accept that. People being charged when they've had an AV1 robot, which they shouldn't have been charged for. I think you've given an example of a school being overcharged in a period. We are happy to look at any accounting mistake. We're not here to take money from people, from schools particularly, that isn't owed. So if there are accounting issues, then we're more than happy to look at it. This is relatively still a new scheme to us. So we always knew there'd be some hiccups along the way. And I think, it's almost a year now it's been in place. This is a good time to sit down and review it, particularly with your kind offer to work with us and say, right, how can we enhance this? How can we improve it? What could we do better?
Okay, thank you, Carl. Tim, did you want to very quickly come in?
There we go. I think, again, just to kind of just reflect and make the point again, in terms of, whilst I appreciate colleagues may not always see the information, I think the point is that that information was shared. I think the report and Carl's indicated that that information was on the bottom of a referral form, and whilst, you know, I wouldn't say it was unilateral, I have to say it was basically saying this is the cost that, you know, that we are asking schools and academies to contribute to the cost of that provision. And so that didn't come into place until April 2024. And I think we just need to distinguish that as well. So prior to April 2024, there was a previous provision where there was no charge to schools and academies. So up until April 2024, a similar process happened, but it was from the April where that additional information was shared. And so to some extent, and I appreciate the challenge around everybody's budgets, you know, and I get that. And actually, for us all, this can't be planned for. And so I do kind of urge everybody to recognise that the intention of this is to kind of support everybody and to be fair with everybody and to charge everybody in the same way for the needs of those individual children. And so from that perspective, I think, you know, it is something that yes, and Carl's indicated that we will review and look at the way in which we move forward. And thanks again, Nick, for some of those suggestions. And, you know, and Carl's indicated, and I guess our request will be to have some volunteers from Schools Forum. Let's have a small group again, just as we do with the High Needs Block Deficit Management Plan, to look at it and how we review it to move it forward. But there is that recognition that there is a requirement for us all to work in partnership with this and accept our, you know, mutual responsibilities about how we support these youngsters, but also how we support the funding of these youngsters.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, I'm conscious of the time. Katie, you've had your hand up for a while.
Hello. I just wanted to echo the points made by Nick, and I know she's worked quite closely with our head teacher, Cathy Forster. We'd also prepared something quite similar. I'm not going to obviously go through it all because it's a lot of it is already being covered by Nick. Just a couple of things to clarify. If we feel we have been overcharged because the money's already been taken from our budget because we're a local authority maintained school, who do we clarify that with, was my first question. And then secondly, it says about the information being shared at district meetings in the summer and whole school training on the 27th of November. Can you clarify what the 27th of November session refers to as well? Apologies if I missed anything. And also, we would be keen to be part of a working party group to move things forward as well.
Thank you, Katie. Carl, did you want to come back on those two? You're on mute, Carl.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I was just going to quickly look at what the 27th of November was. I think 27th of November. Yeah, the 27th of November was a training session about health and education. So it was the session that we did in partnership with health colleagues, looking at reasons why children were off school and how we could get children back to school. So that whole thing was around Section 19 and how we work with children with medical needs. So that was a training session that was open to all Staffordshire schools, and it took place on the 27th of November in the morning. So that's what that was. The raising invoice queries. So if you feel that something was wrong on the invoice, then I guess, I don't know if Sarah's still on the call, but I guess you'd need to take it back to them, and then they could bring the query back to us. Sarah, I'm looking to you. I don't know.
Yeah,
I never had that question. Is that correct?
Sorry, Sarah, can I take your details, please?
Yeah. Sarah.boyle@staffordshire.gov.uk. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Nick.
Just to add to that. Oh, sorry.
Go on.
Just add to that conversation there with Paul that Sarah's team are the people administering the invoicing and extraction, but the instruction comes from Carmen's team, so they're not as a team empowered to actually change those billion and the amount we've deducted. So when it does come through to Helen to administer that, it will be directed back to Carl's team to say, is this right? Have we got it wrong? And if so, what does it need to be? Because Helen's team and Sarah's are just an administrative invoice payments processing debt recovery team, just to make that clear.
Thank you, Anthony. Nick?
Thank you. Just to respond to a couple of those points, and thanks for clarifying some of those, Carl and Tim as well. One of the difficulties for head teachers, whilst we did get those communications, or some people got those communications or were in some of those meetings, it was still done in year and retrospectively for some of those Section 19s that had already been put in place. So you suddenly get charged for something that you'd already referred into and already started to do, and didn't have anything else in place to change it to in the time frame that was given, you know. So I think some schools have been caught out by that decision that the local authority made really quickly in terms of our budgets. You plan so far ahead in your budget, and then to get notification in early spring and then for it to suddenly take effect in April, it's a big hit. So the fact that it was done in year has been a real challenge, and I think that that's affected schools heavily, a lot, particularly those schools who used that provision before and then all of a sudden it's charged for. With regards to the quality assurance and following the syllabus of the peers, the amount of tuition sometimes that's happening, and understandably this is individual because some children aren't able to access that because of illness or whatever it is. The quality assurance is the bit that's easy to do, I suppose, in terms of us communicating and making that better. But then schools are still having to fulfil safeguarding responsibilities, do home visits, do other checks on the children's welfare, put things in place for them to pop into school for mentoring, you know, or to have face-to-face on screen time. And that's with none of that funding, because that's then gone towards Section 19. So it's the part that we're still expected to do, but without that funding in place. And I suppose that's the bit for me that came through really strongly from the feedback that I've had.
Thank you, Nick. Emily and then Mark. I'm really conscious of the time, and some of the detail of this will be worked through by the working group that both Carl and Tim have referred to. So I'm aware that there may be some things that may not necessarily be brought to a conclusion today, but will be worked on in the future. So, Emily.
I think, to be honest, Nick's covered a great deal of what I would want to say. There's real strength of feeling across the profession, and I think that we're in danger of, therefore, a polarisation happening. I think the lesson for me that needs to be learnt is that actually communication is not necessarily consultative at the right point, and just to really reinforce the point that's just been made, I think an announcement or a communication that is, you know, that goes in is not necessarily, it's not timely enough if people don't feel there's been sufficient consultation. So I think I'd just urge for it to I think, again, we've got to revisit the fact that somewhere in this system, whether it's because of the e-bag or whether it's because we've got quite antiquated ways of getting things into the domain of leaders, I think we've got to look again, because it's not seamless enough and it's not happening in a timely manner.
Thank you, Emily. Mark?
Yeah, thank you. At risk of not repeating what everybody said, just a couple of points that heads have raised with me, into particular to reinforce the administration of the bills in some cases is not even close to accurate, and that has generated a real lack of trust and concern. For example, even down to the coding which was proposed, LAAP, we have seen variations of LAPP. It causes great concerns. We've no idea what it means. Heads have shared with me children that have never even attended their school, nothing to do with their school, being billed for. Children on PP being billed for that are not PP, children that are PP not being billed for. So there's a real sense of concern, even if people are are wanting to support the payments, that they can't trust the accuracy of what's been done. We debate communication, for example. I have been sent, I've got in front of me the copy of the form. It changed from the 1st of April moving forward. Clearly does say about the cost, completely accept that. Yet the old form was being pushed around by the local authority representatives. I've got one here dated in July. It's the old form. The head has signed it. It's not accurate, and obviously we've mentioned this before, that the concept around the money following the child for their education, you know, in many cases the provision that's in place is an hour a week of maths tuition online, yet schools and I know this point has been made, the proportionality to the costs of that versus what's been trying to be recouped is not even close. I'm not being patronising, but each bit of money is not ring-fenced per student, and actually most of that money has already been spent on staffing, buildings, and all the other things to then mid-year pay for tutoring that is nowhere near 5-6 grand. So I appreciate your point, Carl, about in some cases we do not recoup the actual cost. In many cases, the costs that are being recouped would far exceed 6 weeks of 1 hour a week of maths tuition online, for example. And the other point that's been made, I am yet to see, especially around the mental health agenda, a successful reintegration of children after a short period of time, which is what it's intended for. Ultimately, we are at risk of having children signed into this system in year 9, still probably, once they get comfortable and once parents really enjoy the fact that they don't have to get them into school anymore, that is going to cost the school the best part of 20,000, I would imagine, for those next 2-3 years. Yet the accountability of the outcomes, the accountability of the attendance marks, all the other things there. So it feels from colleagues that spoke to me the complete lack of proportionality around cost versus provision that's needed. That's my lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. A couple of points to make there. Obviously, there is a strength of feeling that has been heard and noted, and I think that there has been a constructive way forward offered as a consequence of that. So if you are interested in putting yourself forward to work on this with Carl and the authority, then can you let Simon know by email that you're keen to work on that. I'm not going to dwell on the next agenda, but obviously it is, again, a hybrid meeting on Teams for everyone else and for us here in the office. So I'll look forward to seeing everybody in April. I'm very grateful to everybody for their time and contributions this afternoon, and we'll see you in April. Thanks ever so much, everybody.